My name's Jeff Turner. I printed over $1 million in U.S. banknotes, and this is how crime works. I've been called the Picasso of counterfeiting. From my perspective, it wasn't that hard to do it, if that makes sense. It just took a lot of trial and error, basically. The bills just progressively got better and better until eventually got caught, and the Secret Service said the bills I were making were the best they've seen in 25 years. I started counterfeiting when I kind of found myself in a desperate financial situation. I wrecked a work truck, so I lost my job. And, you know, I had a newborn baby at home. The lease was up in our house. So I was just kind of, you know, in a desperate spot. I was just trying to think of some way to get my family back on their feet, you know. And counterfeiting just ended up being like the safest, easiest way. The majority of the money I printed was the 96 series $100 bill. I also counterfeited some of the 2013, the new blue notes, but really that was more of like a hobby for me, like just kind of a challenge. The longest process to start counterfeiting was making the digital files. I would say I spent 2 months of just editing these images. Really, Wikipedia has pretty high resolution photos in their stock, and I broke the image down to multiple layers. So I would have one image of just the background color. I'd jumble up the serial numbers. I knew I needed to find a real thin paper that was opaque enough to where you couldn't see the strip and watermark through the face of the bill. I went through rice paper, vellum paper, tracing paper, you know, toilet paper, wrappers on toilet paper. I ended up finding that Bible paper was perfect. Bible paper glows a dull purple, just like money does. I would acquire the Bible paper by going into like bookstores and just kind of taking out the blank pages. Inevitably, I ran out of bookstores in Knoxville. I would coat the bills with a matte lacquer spray can, which basically enabled the counterfeit detection pens to mark yellow. I would also use invisible ink UV pen to draw an invisible line over the strip. I also found a certain type of iridescent green eyeshadow that I would basically paint on to the 100 in the bottom corner to kind of replicate the color shifting ink. One cashier would run her fingernail along Benjamin Franklin's shirt to kind of feel the rigid texture. I ended up going to like a Hobby Lobby, and I found a fine tip glue pen. It would dry and give a little texture to a shirt. The 3D security ribbon on the modern $100 bill was hard to crack. The Bureau of Engraving and Printing kind of outsources a company to produce the paper and some of the security features. And I was able to find the patent rights, so it's like it basically explained how to do it. The trial and error was definitely frustrating. When I first started counterfeiting, you know, I would just experiment, and I'd mess up 5 for every one that I made well. Towards the end, I could make a perfect counterfeit $100 bill in probably 5 or 10 minutes. I've had a few printers kind of break on me. Sometimes the paper would just get so jammed up. It's not so much noisy because I'm using digital printers, but the matte lacquer spray smells really bad. So a lot of times, like maids at hotels would come into my room and thinking we're like huffing paint or like something, I'd have to say, oh, my wife spilled nail polish, or, you know, just make up these little lies. But eventually I rented a house and I had ventilation fans that would suck the matte lacquer out the window. So I could kind of spray the bills in front of this exhaust fan that it kind of sucked it out the window. There weren't really like big stockpiles of counterfeit money. I would try to like essentially launder the money every day. You know, so I'd print maybe 2,000, 5,000 in the morning and early afternoon, and then I'd try to break all those bills before the end of the night. There was probably like 10 or 20 of like the big corporations, retail, grocery stores, you know, Walmart type stores. And those were the best to break the bills at. I also sold bills to people. 25 cents on the dollar was kind of the going rate. If I was breaking a bill in a store, I would try to go to female cashiers. And if I sent women in with the bills, I would tell them to go to male cashiers. When I would break a bill, I'd give them the exact coinage to kind of distract them a little bit. The majority of your amateur type counterfeiters get kind of called out at the register and, you know, they'll get a license plate number or something. And I would like always park my car far away so they could never get my license plate. I steered away from self-checkout machines because they were just too hard to beat. And some of them even have like photographic software where it just analyzes like the microprinting and all that stuff. In the beginning, I was definitely nervous because I spent so much time, perfecting these bills that I would notice any little, error or anything like that. I think I've got an attention to detail that most people probably don't have. And, the knowledge I have for the security features, I study extensively. There was a few times that I would go to the same grocery store and it turns out that the bills I'd spent last week, they found out about them. But really, most of the time, when a cashier, even if the cashier kind of knows it's fake, they usually give it back to you. Over the 2 years that I was counterfeiting, I probably only had like maybe 3 or 4 cashiers turn me down. And I was spending, thousands of dollars every day. Luckily for me, they only had, I think, like 12 surveillance videos of me. So I was pretty good about kind of staying anonymous. There was a be on the lookout for me and my wife breaking a bill at a specific store. They didn't know my name, though. It was just a picture. The Secret Service has the capability of kind of building cases on people. But as far as local police, I mean, they can't really do much about it, Knoxville has a lot of dealers from out of town. Basically, drugs are more expensive in Knoxville than they are in Detroit or Chicago or Cleveland or Atlanta. So a lot of people kind of go to these mid-level cities to sell their drugs because they're, you can get a brick in Detroit for like $25,000 and then cut it and go sell it for, $100,000 in Knoxville. I was addicted to drugs at the time, so a lot of it was buying drugs with the bills. A few dealers I was honest with, and I would say, this is what I do. And I ended up selling some bills to a drug dealer from Cleveland. But there was a couple cases of I would buy drugs from these people with the counterfeit money. And the guy that actually ended up setting me up, I probably got him for like close to $10,000 over about a month's period. And he said that it was raining one day and one of my bills got wet and the color shifting makeup smeared off. So he found out that they were fake. He was just kind of impressed and, wanted to start buying them from me. These people would drive from Knoxville up to Detroit to buy like a brick of heroin, and they would mix in like 5,000 or 10,000 of my bills when they went to their city to re-up. All different stores have their specific method of detecting counterfeit bills. And a lot of like the big retailers just use the counterfeit pens. So they typically just mark the bill and then, if it marks properly, they cash it. If someone's buying a real cheap item with a $100 bill, that's probably more reason to take a closer look at it. Like looking for the strip and the watermark, holding the bill up to the light helps. Really the best way to tell if a bill's real is like putting it in a bill validator. This is the more modern Blue Note $100 bill. If you hold the bill at a certain angle and shift it, the ink turns from a metallic green to a copper. It's used with magnetic ink. So if you fold a bill in half and set it on the table, you can actually lift it up with a neodymium magnet. There's enough magnetism to actually lift the bill up off the table. So some cashiers will scratch the shirt to feel a kind of rigid texture in the bill. The bills are printed on an intaglio press. that kind of raises the ink above the paper, which gives it a certain type of texture. Bills are really hard. There's kind of like a real crisp feeling to it. Well, yeah, there is a smell to money. And my bills, I've had a couple people, if I sprayed the matte lacquer, like too soon to spending it, you know what I mean? Like a couple people would complain of a smell. I mean, they always accepted the bills because really like every security feature that a cashier would look for, my bills had. So even if they were kind of suspicious or even brought up something like the smell, you know, they still accepted it because there was really no reason to believe it was counterfeit. It was 2019. The dealer from Cleveland, he got arrested up there. He either got caught with my counterfeit money or heroin. And, you know, it didn't take him long to inform on me. And then from there, you know, the Secret Service raided my hotel room. I was in the process of printing when they kicked the door in, so they found computers and printers, and I think I had like 6,400 in counterfeit bills that I tried to flush down the toilet. They pretty much caught me red-handed at that point. I was basically looking at like about 3 years, but the Secret Service came to me and basically said that if I pleaded guilty and showed them how I did everything, then they wouldn't charge my wife with anything, and they would give me cooperation credit, and they'd keep my restitution amount under $100,000. So with the cooperation, that got reduced to 10 to 16 months. The maximum sentence is 20 years. I think, you know, white-collar criminals should still go to prison. I mean, I deserve to go, you know, to prison. I was lucky with the amount of time that I served. It got me sober. Really, it was for the best in my particular case. There are organizations in other countries, you know, that have taken a liking to counterfeiting. It's obviously extremely profitable. And, you know, I've heard that a lot of counterfeits come out of Lima and, you know, Medellin. I've seen some bills that I was told came from like South America, but the quality wasn't very good, I didn't think. It's criminal organizations in the drug trade. And just like from my experience, you know, people who were in the drug trade, obviously they're opportunists. You know, if there's a way to make money any other way, from my experience, you know, they'll do it. There's a supernote, they say, most likely coming out of North Korea, produced by the North Korean government, that is indistinguishable from legitimate currency. It's supposedly has not only all the security features, but all of them done pretty flawlessly. I started counterfeiting when I was 19 years old. I read The Art of Making Money, a book about Art Williams, who was a counterfeiter up in Chicago. And that kind of gave me the original idea, but everything else was kind of like my own methods. The bills weren't super sophisticated, but they were good enough to sell. A friend of mine's dad was kind of like a connected guy in Tampa. But then my friend overdosed and died. I basically just stopped doing it. You know, at that point, I didn't want to get caught. And of course, when I started up again later on, it's all because of, you know, just a desperate financial situation that kind of, you know, I was racking my brain for any ways to make quick money. I don't think, you know, there will ever be a way to prevent counterfeiting. You know, even if it goes digital, there's still ways of counterfeiting cashless. Like a person I know was counterfeiting credit cards. The $1 million or so that I had made over my career hasn't impacted the economy much, I would say. But, you know, maybe on like the local level, it might make people lose trust in cash. In fact, a lot of stores in Knoxville don't accept $100 bills anymore. They've got little signs at like Dollar Generals and certain stores that I frequented. Obviously, you know, this whole situation kind of flipped my life upside down. I'm sure it wasn't easy on my kids. I had to go to prison. My wife and I are now separated. So, I mean, it's been, rough on all of us. Now I am the production manager at a printing and graphics company in Knoxville.
My name is Robert Mazur. I spent 2 years undercover laundering tens of millions of dollars for Pablo Escobar's cartel. This is how crime works. Money laundering enables cartels to produce the most lethal thing that they produce around the world, and that's corruption. It enables them to be able to control countries, presidents of countries. Operation Sea Chase was a multi-agency task force to prosecute the biggest money launderers of the Medellin cartel. Most of the people I dealt with were high-level drug traffickers who had hundreds of millions of dollars. I'm doing this interview in silhouette because 2 agencies and an intelligence agency informed me that the Medellin cartel issued a contract on my life. I spent a year and a half putting together what I think is one of the more sophisticated fronts used in undercover. I built the persona of Robert Musella. I dressed the part, certainly had the lifestyle, drove a Rolls Royce, Mercedes, Jaguar. I was embedded in real businesses. Had an air charter service with a private jet. We had a jewelry chain with 30 locations on the East Coast. A lot of cash goes through the Diamond District every single day. So if you've got those kinds of businesses, you have a very good excuse for where the cash came from. I was embedded in an investment company, a mortgage brokerage business, and even a brokerage firm with a seat on the New York Stock Exchange. And then I and my partner began a 2-year infiltration of the Medellin cartel and the banks that were supporting them. One of the keys to doing undercover work is to build your undercover persona to have as many traits as you do in common. Robert Musella was from Staten Island. I'm from Staten Island. Robert Musella was a businessman. I have a business background. I didn't fake accents, fake anything. I was always just me. The first person I met that was working within the Medellin cartel is a gentleman by the name of Gonzalo Mora, a small-time money launderer who had an import-export business, but the capacity he had to launder was probably limited to about $50,000 a week at best. We had my partner, Emir, deal with him and simply say, listen, my boss handles a lot of this, but he never wants to meet you. He wants to stay in the shadows. But if you could ever convince him to come out of the shadows, the rivers would open and you'd be able to launder untold amounts of money. By the end of that 6 months, Gonzalo Mora was banging on the door to meet me. It's always best to play hard to get. I also knew these people have a sixth sense. If you're afraid of a dog, they know that. You're the first one they bite. I didn't want to get bit. So I knew that I would be working against myself and undermining my cause if I showed any fear whatsoever. And I told him eventually, listen, I have to get these people to understand that they need to let me invest some of their money. Your only responsibility is to introduce me to them. If I succeed, we'll even do business bigger. He felt compelled to make the introductions, and then I started to climb up the ladder to meet bigger and bigger people. Money launderers, like I played the role of, are basically operating what's called the black money market. It's an informal banking system that's made available to people who operate through the underground. So as a black money market operator, I have a supply of dollars. My supply comes from drug traffickers. Now I have to find people who have a demand for dollars. People who want to buy dollars are oftentimes importers around the world who otherwise have to go through their central bank and spend 25% of their money to officially get dollars. I could sell it to them for 10%. My traffickers, in many instances, wanted Colombian pesos. So the best people I could sell those dollars to were Colombian importers. All I have to do is swap. So I had supply clients, traffickers, and demand clients. But most often the money would wind up into bank accounts controlled by the cartel in Panama. And from there, they distributed it around the world wherever they wanted to hide it. Well, sometimes the money had to be used to buy planes. Like there was a guy, his responsibility was acquiring the aircraft and trucks and things like that the cartel needed. So he basically was the buyer of the cartel's Air Force. So I dealt with him because he needed money in order to buy the specific planes they were looking for, which were Rockwell 1000s and Rockwell 980s. Some money is smuggled out of the United States down to Colombia, and it's used to make payoffs to people in the military or prosecutors or politicians or whoever's help they need to buy. Most of the money's in 5, 10s, and 20s. That's because people using illegal drugs buy it with 5, 10s, and 20s. That gets collected by people who have a responsibility here for the cartels to do nothing other than collect money. They try not to have traffickers and money handlers in the same place. Too much asset to potentially be lost. So the dollars generally would come to me in suitcases, duffel bags, boxes. New York was a key point. You get $1 million, $2 million per delivery. I generally had runners who picked it up and brought it. You don't usually get the guy who really controls the safe on the street. The way it works is we get the information from Gonzalo Mora. So he might give us a phone number in the form of an invoice number. He might say that, you need to get in touch with Guapo, and he's going to have 250 boxes. It's 250,000. They generally like to meet in a public area, so it might be at a McDonald's. They sit down, not much gets said, pushes the keys across the table. It's in the trunk. Amir goes and gets the money. It's usually wrapped in rubber bands in blocks of 5,000 and 10,000, depending upon denominations. A lot of people say, wow, isn't it tempting? You've got all these millions and millions of dollars and it's in cash. There's unfortunately been people in just about every agency that has fallen victim into a slippery slope of greed. My motivation was information became my heroin. If I couldn't get the next big piece of information and I couldn't risk more than I did to get the last piece of information, I felt as though I wasn't accomplishing my mission. Yeah, I was addicted, but I was addicted to information. Layering is a process by which a series of corporations, usually offshore entities, are used to continue to receive what initially started off maybe as a suitcase full of cash. The way we layered, the money would first be put into a certificate of deposit in Luxembourg in the name of an offshore entity. That money was used by the bank as collateral for a loan in a different part of the world. So let's say the loan was in Paris, and that was to a Gibraltar corporation. And then that Gibraltar corporation would transfer the funds to Panama, and then from there to accounts controlled by the drug traffickers. And so the purpose that you use layering for is to just confuse the route in which the money is being moved. In order for anyone to trace the money backward, you have to first pierce the corporate veil in Panama and bank secrecy laws. Then you have to pierce the same in France. Then you have to pierce the same in Luxembourg. A lot of times what they do, if they don't want to deal with a person like me, they will use an army of couriers, call them Smurfs, the little blue guys, Smurfs running all over. We kind of dub them Smurfs because, let's say there's 10 of them. Their job every day is to go to meet with their money contact. And the guy may have $500,000 in the trunk. And each of them gets $50,000 and a map that tells them where it is locally they can go to use cash to buy MoneyGrams, cashier's checks, money orders, traveler's checks. They'll buy a money order for $987.25 to try to make it look like it's for a payment. Leave the payee blank. They generally don't want to buy anything over $3,000. So at the end of the day, $500,000 that filled the trunk was now a stack maybe 8 inches high of money orders, traveler's checks. There were times when those were offered to me to then take it from there and launder it. That was safety for them because we were not having direct contact with their main money people. We were just getting a FedEx box with $500,000 in money orders. I think the biggest deposit was somewhere around 2.1 million. There was a time that I met in Paris with Pablo Escobar's main lawyer, a guy named Santiago Uribe, and some other people that worked directly with Pablo. He sent Uribe to assess our money laundering processes. And at the end of that meeting, we came to an agreement. We would receive, in a relatively short period of time, $100 million that they wanted to put into a nest egg in Europe in case they had to flee. So when we get back from Europe, we started getting deliveries, $1 million in the morning, $2 million in the afternoon. I had told the people who were doing surveillance that they needed to be really careful, and we needed to try to keep it as light as we could because they would have counter surveillance out there. And one of the people who I dealt with, a person who met with Pablo Escobar often, told me, make sure your people look on the street for gringos, white guys, who are in their late 20s, early 30s, in good shape, wearing jeans, pullover shirts with collars, solid color, jogging shoes, fanny packs, that's where their guns are hidden. Those are los feos, the ugly ones. That's informally what people in the cartel call the feds. So I never used to want to go into an office, but this was getting very important, so I met with the people who were going to do the surveillance, and there was a room full of gringos with jeans, pullover shirts that were solid with collars, and they had fanny packs. And I tried to convince them that that was a uniform that everybody was looking for, but egos are such in law enforcement that sometimes people don't want to take that advice. So anyway, the surveillance got burned. And the next thing that happened is that my partner, Amir Abreu, received a phone call from Gonzalo Mora. And in the background was a screaming voice of Gerardo Moncada, Pablo Escobar's main manager, who was screaming that Musella, I, had to be a DEA undercover agent because they saw all the feds there and all deals from here on were off. And I had to talk myself out of that. I guess the point is that there are a lot of different moving parts to these undercover operations. And it's pretty easy for any one of us to do something that might potentially endanger somebody else on the team. All of the traffickers said to me, you know, I love your money laundering system, but the end payout is US dollar checks from accounts that are in the United States. We want you to open up US dollar accounts in Panama. Panama uses the US dollar more than it does its own currency. They know that secrecy is big in Panama. By corporations, by banks, it's harder for DEA to get the information concerning the accounts. But what they told me also was, listen, we want your accounts in Panama because we own General Manuel Noriega, and he will not touch any of your accounts because you're with us. So now I have to open up an account in Panama. I happened to be driving past a branch in Tampa of the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, the 7th largest privately held bank in the world. It was a big gold sign. I would have never walked in there if it wasn't for that. And they said, well, we'll give you a meeting if you can give us a resume. I had a fully verifiable resume, and I had bank accounts with millions of dollars in it, all of which the bank in particular wanted to see before they opened up to me and explained to me how they laundered money for many people in organized crime. And I said to him, all of my clients are from Medellin, Colombia. They operate businesses here in the States that are very sensitive. And it's my job to very cautiously help them to move capital across borders. So he goes, well, that's the black money market. We have plenty of customers who deal in that business. He said, you know, yeah, Panama is where you want to be. There's a lot of hands in which these checks go through. And sometimes mistakes can be made. And in fact, that's the way I got really inside the Bank of Credit and Commerce International. That got me into the inner circle of dirty officers in BCCI, and then I went on to meet more than a dozen of them. The number one person who managed my accounts, a gentleman by the name of Amjad Awan, he managed accounts for people who ran countries, for Manuel Noriega. He helped launder Noriega's drug profits from the protection he sold to the Medellin cartel. And during that time, we recorded about 1,200 conversations, all of which were used as the cornerstones of the prosecution of not just drug traffickers and money launderers, but senior officials of the Bank of Credit and Commerce International. I needed to coax the conversations into the areas where I was exposing their true intent, their involvement in criminality. I couldn't allow them to dance around issues. You have to try to get a way to have the conversation. So one of the things that I used during that time frame, one of the most famous businessmen at the time in the late 80s was a guy by the name of Lee Iacocca. He ran Chrysler. Everybody knew who he was. And so when I would talk to people, especially at the bank, I would say, you know, if my clients came in this room, you might mistake them as being Lee Iacocca. The big difference is they don't sell cars, they sell coke. I dealt with dirty bankers. I dealt with lawyers in Switzerland who formed corporations to hide the source of our funds. I dealt with attorneys in Panama, people who ran financial service corporations that do nothing other than form tens of thousands of corporations for people all over the world. They provide nominee directors that hide the beneficial ownership of accounts and the control of corporations. All of these people are intermediaries who the underworld counts on. There were other people, real money launderers at that time, who were sending what they claimed to be precious metals in and out of the United States, which actually was lead that was covered by gold. And that was their cover for why they were depositing cash and were not bashful about it, talking to the bank and saying, you know, this is a cash generating business. You know, if you have enough that's believable, it's amazing how quickly they'll convince themselves that you are who you say you are. June of 1988. I was told that it would be the first week of October that the operation would be taken down. I've got 2 years worth of work to do, and I got to get it done in about 3 months. You know, so many times these undercover operations result in indictments, but the bad guys, they're in countries that do not offer extradition. Colombia was one. Someone suggested, well, why don't we have some kind of a personal event? One of the agents said, you know, well, they obviously appear to like Bob. How about a wedding? So we put this together for a supposed wedding in Innisbrook, which is a country club. This got personal. You know, in some instances, children of future defendants were part of the wedding, wives. And the night before, one of my informants went around to the defendants and said, hey, Bob doesn't know this. We're going to have a bachelor party. The cars will be here soon. The arrest team's there. They arrest them. Everybody was in disbelief. And the case concluded with the arrest of about 85 individuals, the collection of fines and forfeitures of about $600 million, and the seizure of about 3,000 pounds of cocaine. Ultimately, the bank imploded on the night of the arrests. You know, it was all high fives. They wanted to go out and have a celebratory gathering. I wanted nothing to do with that whatsoever. I was emotionally exhausted. I first learned about the contract on my life about 30 days after the undercover Operation Sea Chase was over. The longest trial lasted 6 months. I was on the witness stand. I could see the hatred in their eyes, even more so in the eyes of their family members who were there. No doubt, you know, they didn't see me as a person who was just doing their job. They saw me as a person who tricked them. But I never tricked anybody into doing anything other than trusting me. Nobody in there did anything that they hadn't done before. After I testified, my family and I rented a motorhome. We went into the mountains, got away from everybody, and tried to heal. There was a pager number, an 800 number that they could call, the office could call and leave me a message, and occasionally I would check. And I got word that the jury had convicted every single person of virtually all accounts. I went back to the campsite by a river and just sat there thinking about it. And it occurred to me that it was so surreal that I had done the same things that the bankers had done, and I was getting awards, and they were about to go to jail for a long time. And I don't take what I did lightly. Some people think it's a sign of weakness. You know, I did drop a tear or two that day. I kind of think that was good because I want a government with conscience. I don't want people high-fiving. It's unfortunate, but the law enforcement community and the private sector responsible for trying to attack money laundering have been highly unsuccessful. The United Nations on Drugs and Crime estimates that roughly $400 billion is generated each year from the sale of illegal drugs. What I really do believe needs to be done, you have to understand there are two different sides of banking. There's the sales side and the compliance side. Sales side brings in the accounts. Compliance in an unhealthy bank only does the background to make sure they're not dealing with a bad guy. That needs to be brought together. I'm suggesting it only on accounts that have $5 million or more that have been received in a year. I think that the account relationship manager that brought the account in should have to file with the bank a sworn statement affirming that they've asked certain questions that if you ask them would expose whether or not it is an account that's being run by front people. Those questions don't get asked, and they don't get asked now because the sales side always tells the compliance side, if I ask those questions, we won't get this business, because they don't want to answer those questions. You know, we have a joint terrorism task force run by the FBI, but is also participated in by, I don't know how many hundred agencies. There should be a joint money laundering task force that does the exact same thing. You know, there has been an evolution of cryptocurrency. There are people who've been involved in the drug world who have used cryptocurrency. Unlike cash, you can follow crypto. The other problem you have with crypto is you only need to look at Bitcoin and see that, unlike the US dollar, its value is not stable. I don't think it's really ready for the big time in the drug world. What is big? Gold refining in the Middle East, Dubai. That's big. I retired from undercover work after the second operation when I almost got killed, and that was in the late 90s. I'm extraordinarily grateful to have the platform from which I get the opportunity to speak, and that platform is first a book called The Infiltrator that became a New York Times bestseller, and the basis for a film by the same name starring Bryan Cranston. And then subsequently, a book I wrote this past year came out called The Betrayal, a nonfiction book about the second undercover operation that I did. But as long as I've got that platform, I'm going to do everything I can to try to share information that can in some way try to help us with the problem we face with this massive illegal drug problem in our country and around the world.
My name's Ed Calderon. I'm a former Baja police agent. I currently work as a security consultant in the United States. This is how crime works. Gun smuggling has armed the people that killed a lot of the people that I used to work with. A lot of these groups are actually stockpiling these firearms for long periods of time. It's hard for anybody to keep track of numbers and what gets found and what doesn't get found in a country where realistically nobody's keeping count. I think the flow is this. Drugs make their way north, and firearms and money make their way south. 70% of all firearms come from the north, from the United States. Operación Hormiga, they call it, Operation Ant, basically. Individuals carrying these small pistols across the border is a very common thing. So how many times can they cross the border? Well, if they're Americans, there's no limit to how many times they can cross that border. It's a pretty easy process to grabbing an AK-47, taking it apart into its basic components, putting it in a backpack, and just walking across some of the ports of entry. Another one is just basically having some of these firearms duct tape and or shrink wrapped onto your person. So let's imagine I have 5 mules. Each of them is capable of carrying around probably 2 guns on their legs, duct taped to their legs, maybe 2 more higher up on their thighs, and maybe 2 on their chest. Just multiply that by the amount of people you have doing that on a daily basis. Filling their pockets with ammunition, filling cornflakes boxes with ammunition as well. Tijuana is basically Silicon Valley when it comes to finding ways of smuggling things from through one of the most watched borders on the planet, basically. There's body shops, there's places that install radios, there's a bunch of people with a lot of experience in modifying vehicles down there. These businesses have been known to basically construct some of these concealment compartments in vehicles. Many occasions we would encounter or find firearms of different kinds and different vehicle hides in and around some of the places where we operated. Things like pushing the volume knob on the radio and then pulling the brake on the car will release a latch on the passenger side seat, revealing a concealed firearm. American vehicles are the preferred kind. You'll see recreational vehicles utilizing festive days where, spring break, where you'll see a surge of traffic going from the north to the south. A lot of the smuggling operations that have utilized concealment related to regular commercial shipments from the United States into Mexico of agricultural equipment, electrical appliances. A lot of these companies are basically utilized as fronts, and or without knowledge of these companies, they get loaded up with extra stuff on their way towards the border as they pick up a load somewhere in the United States and try and introduce it into Mexico. Another aspect of it is tunnels. Drug tunnels. Again, firearms do get moved through those drug tunnels that have been operating and are still operating. Some of the most interesting ones that we managed to see was French-style trebuchets, which are basically giant catapults flinging things across the border at some ungodly speeds. Drone technology. The first crashed cartel drone that I directly saw was a large quad drone that crashed right on the border where the Tijuana River treatment plant is. We saw remote control vehicles, small ones, toy ones basically, loaded up with firearms, munitions, and money, being driven across the border by radio control. This is not my opinion, but the Border Patrol is one of the most corrupted federal institutions in the United States. There's been many cases and convictions against them. And it's these gun runners have people everywhere and have and own people in some of these ports of entry and pay corrupted officials across the border. It is interesting that you do not get searched at all at times crossing into Mexico. But if you cross into San Diego, your vehicle gets scanned, you have to step out of the car. Sometimes you have to take off your backpack and put it into an x-ray machine so it gets x-rayed. Density scanners might be utilized to try and detect some of the firearms going across the border. But those x-rays are used sporadically. Every now and then you'll get one get used, and it's rare that they find something. There's explosive detection dogs that are out there that are trained to detect explosives, munitions, for example. But again, you have to realize to not only create a dog canine program that is able to detect some of these things, but to maintain them is not an easy thing. In my experience, most of the arrests that we made were pitazos. A pitazo is a Mexican slang word for somebody told on them. Usually it's a personal thing, or usually it's somebody just eliminating competition. Those vehicle hides, a lot of these gun runners that have been caught in the past were random acts of pure luck or somebody trying to cut the competition out. "20-year-olds, 18-year-olds that have a clean record get hired to buy some of these guns in some of these places. And then they get gathered by the gun runners. Somebody that has a vehicle, who's a retiree American, that crosses the border regularly somehow, maybe goes camping in Baja and stuff like that. It's a perfect candidate to be a mule for firearms. And you'll load a bunch of cars with people that are not who you would typically expect to stop at the border. So they basically utilize, people camouflage. What do people expect to see on the border as far as a drug smuggler? So they're going to shy away from that. Women get utilized a lot to move things around. Older women, because of the cultural stigma of Mexican police agents as far as trying to physically search a female, much less a female that is older in age. Social media is a very big part of it. Not only the advertisement of some of these things being sold in some places, but also recruitment of small purchase buyers on the U.S. side. Cartels will troll places like TikTok, will have social media accounts related to one of their members or showcasing some of their activities online. And you'll see wannabes or people sending DMs and stuff like that on the U.S. side, kids that want to be a part of the lifestyle. It's easy money for a kid, the economy, the lack of opportunities for a lot of these young people. Even with educations down there, it's hard to it's hard to find a job. I was approached several times when I was going through my process of turning into a police officer, and it only takes you doing something for a criminal organization like any of these cartels that operate on that border. It only takes once for them to know your name, to know how to contact you, to know that you are able to provide a service once. And the first time it's voluntary, the second time they're gonna tell you to do something. The person buying that gun and then handing it to somebody that's gonna then traffic it down south, he got probably $200, so that's the first payment, you know. And then that gun is now going to be probably doubled down south, or maybe 80% more of the value is going to be added onto it. So you have something that might be worth $800 and now worth $1,500 down there in the hands of somebody that wants that specific gun. The further south you go, the more expensive the firearm. That's kind of the rules about it. The closer you are to the border, the cheaper it is. The gun runner might have connections and he might paid somebody off. Usually if it's a large shipment, he'll have security with him as soon as he crosses. By this I mean people that are watching the load and move with him. You know, some of these people might drive it to a body shop, or they might drive it to one of these beach resorts where you can park your camper there, and that is when the deal happens. That could be where some money gets exchanged. It could have gotten exchanged on the northern side, but that's when the guns become property of whoever is going to get them. I've seen some of the gun runners put guns into places like Tecate, which is to the east in the desert, and basically in traditional places where they can avoid military checkpoints if they can. Or sometimes they don't even care because they actually paid off some of the military as well. It is not an easy process to get to procure a legal firearm in Mexico. Mexico has a single blanket firearms law. There's a single firearms store in Mexico. And if anybody wants a firearm legally in Mexico, you have to be able to pay for a bunch of documentations, and you usually end up with an overpriced pistol and not a lot of ways to buy bullets for that pistol unless you belong to a shooting club. And if you belong to a shooting club in Mexico, that's a very expensive thing. So in essence, legal possession of firearms is something that upper middle class people can afford. So people are desperate, and if they want security, usually in Mexico as a civilian, you'll go into the black market. Most of the gun-friendly places on the border are usually where these things are purchased. Texas, Arizona, sometimes even further north, where person-to-person sales and private sales are more permitted, where gun shows are pretty prevalent. Somebody will walk into a gun store and buy and purchase a couple of firearms. And some of these things get moved from a permissive or a place where firearms laws are pretty pretty open to places like California. And the reason you see that is because they're actually being utilized to pay drug loads sometimes. You also have a lot of people ordering some of these firearm parts through the mail now, which is a new method of smuggling as well. People will buy some of these things in the United States and then mail them down to Mexico under false labels and declarations as far as what's inside of those boxes for accessories for firearms, and being gathered at a private home, packaged and labeled falsely, and then sent south through packaging services. There's been many cases of things being taken off military bases in California, for example. Grenades that are clearly coming from military installations in the United States and or are taken from military bases by corrupted soldiers. Every now and then you'll see bigger caliber equipment down there. The truth is those account for about 70% of illegal firearms found in Mexico in the hands of cartels and murder scenes and in the heads of dead sicarios. The truth is that it's probably more than that. They assassinate political candidates. They use explosives, terror tactics, psychological tactics. They capture, imprison people. Right now, currently, there's the Sinaloa cartel that's historically been dominating the border and a big part of Mexico. But now there's a new generation cartel, which is a very new, ultra-violent, militarized, almost guerrilla force that is taking over. And with groups like these, they have very specific firearms that they want to buy. So they're not only looking for a gold-plated AK-47 anymore, they're actually looking for night vision equipment to install on their firearms. They're looking for suppressors to put on a 50 caliber precision rifle that they procure. You'll see these commercial gun manufacturers making a very cool, aesthetically cartel-like pistol. It's obvious if you have a gun company creating a gold gun for a civilian market that they're trying to tap into a fascination and or a culture that is currently kind of being fostered, a narco culture. A narcocultura or narco culture is something that's been going on in Mexico for decades. The fascination or the treatment of some of these criminal organizations as almost a Robin Hood type character, where they're robbing from the rich and stealing from the poor. I can't tell you that making guns impossible to get or restricted or illegal, something like you would see in Australia, would be a solution to anything, because guns are already out there. There's a lot of people that want to blame the United States for everything. I think they clearly have responsibility when it comes to some of the firearms crossing that border. You have the United States basically outsourcing its counter-drug policy and counter-cartel policy to Mexico through money. The United States, I would say, should do a better job of keeping track of what that money is being used for in Mexico. Some of the arrests that have been made recently by American law enforcement sharing some of their information with Mexico, like sights, lasers, things of this nature, for accessories for firearms, basically. This is what's been every now and then gets caught. But again, it's a drop in the bucket with what actually gets through. When we saw some of this activity, and who do we tell? Do we tell the same law enforcement agencies that didn't let us know about all those guns walking across that border that ended up killing a bunch of my friends? You know, it was my experience to actually find some of these Fast and the Furious guns during my time active, in the form of some FN-57 pistols that were used on some of my friends that I used to work with. This was an ATF operation. The ATF would approach places of gun sales and keep an eye out for certain types of purchases of firearms. The ATF wanted to let these guns walk so they can track them down to Mexico to see if they can somehow make a case for something bigger. But realistically, all they did was let almost 2,000 guns walk across the border. And most Mexicans saw that as a major, not only betrayal by the United States, but also a bunch of conspiracy theories started popping up you know, why would you introduce so many firearms into Mexico? The anti-American sentiment in Mexico is at an all-time high, and it's been growing. I think as a Mexican, somebody who was actually born down there and experienced some of the violence that some of these firearms help foster down there. I think the biggest misconception about gun smuggling is that these guns have somehow, there's a lot of effort being put forth by the Mexican government to stop these guns from coming down to Mexico. The straw purchasers up here get a slap on the wrist. I think, yeah, some of those penalties should be steeper. The Mexican government, through Marcelo Ebrard, is basically sued a lot of the major American gun manufacturers. The only group legally allowed to sell firearms in Mexico is the military. So it's interesting that the Mexican government did a lawsuit against American gun manufacturers, but they didn't mention in that lawsuit the people that they buy their firearms from. Mexico has a very big problem with corruption, and it has attempted many times to curtail this corruption by developing whole organizations to try and keep police honest. I was put through FBI background checks. I did polygraph testing every year. But even with all of those safety precautions, people flipped. And when they left, they didn't hand over their rifles or their guns sometimes, so they would take them with them. I was a Baja police agent for about 12 years. I did that job till it was time to leave. The corruption levels in the institution that I was in became completely unsustainable, and anybody that wanted to actually do their job and be honest about it was not in fashion or in vogue at that time. I had to leave my job in a hurry. There's no retirement, no severance package. It's a pretty hard job to do. It's a pretty thankless one. But there's a lot of people that are in that fight, a lot of people that are honest, a lot of people that never took a dime. I somehow made it out alive of that system. After concluding my 12 years of service down there, I came to the United States, and utilizing some of the experience and know-how that I got from that experience down south, I've now become a subject matter expert, do training for civilians, private companies, and the government across the country. Specifically, gun smuggling has armed the people that killed a lot of the people that I used to work with. It definitely has had an effect, not just on me, but on most of my generation. I want to give a voice to the countless people down there that went through some of the experiences that I went through. Some of the widows left behind, some of the orphans left behind by some of the conflicts that went on down there. I'm trying to keep that memory and that voice alive for them.
My name is Brian Sobolewski. I'm a former diamond thief, and I stole $2.3 million worth of gold and jewelry throughout New England. And this is how crime works. I would compare the jewelry business to the drug business in terms of how shady it is. You're never getting the diamond they tell you is there. You're probably buying junk most of the time. The markup is somewhere between 500% to 800% when you walk into a store to try to buy a diamond. I was 20 when this started, 25 when I was arrested. So it was a 5-year span. So you had my dad, who was the mastermind. My brother, he was the muscle. I was usually the driver. I was usually the lookout. We had an inside guy. Bill was a friend of my dad's. So he would basically feed us who was a good person to go after. If we were going into a store, he would tell us where the safe is, what time the safe opened up, what time the guy would be there. He himself was a traveling salesman. That's how he knew everybody. We used Bill to place an order if it was a store, just so we knew that that product would be in the store and we'd have a certain amount that we'd be able to get from the store. The landscape at the time was you had a lot of mom and pop jewelry stores. You didn't have a whole lot of chains. There was K Jewelers, there were a couple of like major chains, but most of them were independent, and they had traveling salesmen with their product line in their car, and they would travel to these stores and try to sell to them. We tried to hit anybody that had claimed false insurance or false robberies prior. We never went after anybody clean. And that's very hard to find in the jewelry business. You'd be surprised how many of these guys are reporting fake robberies and taking the insurance money. Casing a job it's maddening, but it's super, super, super important. It's about recognizing traffic, what time a patrol car might go by. All of this stuff fed into what time of day we would do a job, usually during the day. We didn't mind crowds. Crowds could sometimes help you. People, being interested in what's going on there. So for Seabrook, for the Woody job, it was basically, what time does he come to work? Where does he pull his car up? The Raynham robbery, my brother and I went into a Papagino's right next door, grabbed a slice, and then went back in the car and ate it, and everyone from Papagino's remembered us. Every single person. So that's one of the things about casing. You got to notice, but you can't be noticing. So the cars that we used were never ours. We would go back at night, take the car, we'd go into a mall parking lot, I would unscrew somebody's license plate, we would put that on the car, we would use the car. My dad would bring it back the next night. He'd just leave it back on the lot. You could never prepare for every eventuality. There would be no scenario that we could practice and go through that wouldn't eventually present some issue that we would have to overcome. I would go in as a customer based on being as average as possible, but I didn't like it either. It was nerve-wracking. Having a duffel bag with rope, bolt cutters, just in case we had to cut a lock that we didn't have a key for. My dad would go in with his girlfriend. It sounds so sexist, but we needed to have a female. Most of the traveling salesmen that we were going after were males, so it wasn't necessarily about how many bodies we needed, it was more about what gender it was. One of the things that we had to do was make sure that we could get into the safe. We knew that if the insurance company protocol for you having loose diamonds and being able to sell them and have them insure them is that every single time you go to that safe to bring a diamond out, that safe gets relocked. But my dad did it in a way that he kept sending the guy back and forth from the safe, that eventually the guy would just leave the safe open. And most people didn't follow the protocol to the letter. So once we knew the safe was open, that's when we would take down the store. It was 90 seconds at the beginning of the robbery. So when my dad and his girlfriend go in there and start talking, that's not the 90 seconds. It's 90 seconds from when Kev comes in and the guy's subdued. That's when we hit the clock. And that 90 seconds is done. I don't know what you have in your pockets, but we gotta go. So there were times we left a case behind. We didn't take everything. The 90-second rule came from bank robbers. They tell you that you cannot spend 90 seconds in a bank because if you go for the vault, it's gonna be more than 90 seconds and you're dead. Everything was based on Kev. He could subdue a victim. It was either cuffs or duct tape or sometimes just standing over him with the gun. So my brother would jump over the case, grab him and put him down. Say, just keep your mouth shut, we'll be out of here in a couple seconds. Nobody's gonna get hurt. My dad went after the safe, I went after the cases. One time we encountered a safe that when we opened, it didn't have what we thought was in it. And my dad just wasn't convinced. And he started fooling around with the bottom of the safe and he pressed it and popped up and everything was inside. The bottom was hollowed out. So I'd always have a ball peen hammer. And those cases are not easy to break because they all have a layer of plastic in the middle. So when you hit it, just a hole. You have to keep smashing and eventually push down this whole piece of cracked glass and then it makes the items very difficult to get to. So that's why some of these cases, even the jewelry store windows, there were people in the 80s that would smash and grab through the window. My dad had rules. We tried not to hurt anybody. In the scenario that we were going into a store that wasn't ours, and we were looking to rob a traveling salesman, we would stage it so that when the guns were pulled out, they were only pointed at the victim. So we purposely didn't point them at the store owner so that the victim would say, hey, is he in on it? And that's exactly what happened. There was a plan that my dad had and wanted to hatch that we would go in and actually take down as many stores as we could in the Jewelers building in Boston. There is an actual building with 5 or 6 floors full of jewelers. It was something that we squashed because the front desk guy was a police officer. We never had to deal with any security guards because at the time there weren't many jewelry stores that required an armed guard be there. The only one was the double doors and we didn't even go in. And you'll notice that about most street level jewelry stores is there's a foyer and you cannot hold both doors open together at the same time. You'd have to go through one, take a number of steps before you get to the next one. And that's because they can lock that foyer. And at that point, we're like, nope, most of these stores buzz you in. I can't get into a jewelry store now without being buzzed in. They don't use a high-tech security system during the day because you have foot traffic. And that stuff, you know, are you talking about laser beams that are tripped once you go past them? Well, you can't use that during the day. There are alarmed cases now. But again, you have to consider who's responding to the alarm. When's the last time you did anything about a car alarm? If during the day, during business hours, an alarm is going off, I think for a good couple of minutes, most people are gonna think it's a fluke and wait for it to shut off. Most people's first instinct isn't to call the police when they hear that. So now you have a live armed guard in a store now. I think the Pink Panther breaking and entering style jewelry store robbery went away when security systems didn't have to be connected to your phone. So once a silent alarm once it's tripped, it can contact the satellite calls the cops. You can't stop that unless you find a way to cut the electricity to that entire structure. And even then they have backup systems. So yes, if the power does go out, that security system's still gonna work. If we left in the stolen car, we would meet the Bronco, we would throw everything in the back and I would go home. That's when I had the opportunity to start going through the stuff. We had to keep the stuff in the house. So we would have $500 to $1 million worth of jewelry, retail, wholesale, that's probably about 100 grand worth of stuff. My dad would separate it into, here are the necklaces, here are the bracelets, here are the rings, here are the uncut gems, here are the cut gems, here are the set gems. From there, it's just putting them into packages that we could sell to jewelry stores. High-end stuff is super, super, super hard to sell. You know, little trinkets, little chains. My dad made more money off these little glass jars with little beads inside. If it sparkles, people will buy it. So for us, no, there wasn't a level of preference in terms of what you were grabbing. But if I got 5 cases in front of me and one's full of diamonds and one's full of gold chain, I'm going for that. The gold chain is way easier to sell quicker than a diamond ring is. You don't want to deal with uncut. because then you got to go find a place to cut them, and that's not easy to do. I would rather sell you a set stone than a loose stone, because more of it's done and you can charge more for it. You're charging for the gold. So when you go in and you buy a diamond now, you're paying for the diamond, you're paying for whatever the gold is in weight. Bill was our main dump site for a lot of the stuff. Was the other person. He was a jeweler in Nashua. And this was a guy that understood that the markup is where you make your money. And if you buy stolen stuff, you can mark the hell out of it. So if you buy it at 50 cents on the dollar, you can already just charge what you normally would, charge a little bit more and really, really clean up. Bought a lot of our stolen stuff in bulk. So getting rid of jewelry in bulk, very difficult to do, because as soon as you have your hands on it, you're an accomplice. So there's a lot to it. So you got to understand, after a robbery, every single pawn shop is, the cops say, if you see any of this stuff, you call us. So we couldn't just go to a pawn shop and say, here, buy all this stuff. We put it through piecemeal. So it's great to have a pocket full of diamonds, but if you don't have anywhere to dump it or fence it, and fencing is what we call the selling of stolen goods. Get caught buying fenced stuff, and you're screwed. And that's how most people get caught in these situations. Jewelry party is where you just invite it's like a Tupperware party with jewelry. So come in and look at our product. We would lay everything out on the table, display it, and people would just look at it, and it's cash. It's just a cash business. A lot of diamonds are laser inscribed with serial numbers. You can buy fake paperwork for this stuff. So at the time, it was rare that anything was engraved. The technology wasn't there, and the technology was expensive. So you have now certifying bodies out there that will give you a certificate that says, this is the diamond you're buying, and this is how it's graded, and this is blah, blah, blah. But you can pay for those. One of the ways we used to tell was scraping glass. You might go into a jewelry store or a pawn shop, and they'll take a little pen and they'll hit it with a little electrical current to tell if it's a real diamond. You're pretty much okay buying any gold, but you got to make sure it's stamped. So if you have a piece of gold that's, they say is 18 karat gold, but there's no stamp that says 18K, it probably isn't. Gold will not magnetize. That might be a way. I used to I'd take some of the stolen jewelry and try to sell it for drugs, and they used to dip it in bleach, because they say bleach reacts to the other metal that's in the gold. That's not true. It doesn't work. I'm not going to a store and buy jewelry right now, because you're paying an exorbitant markup, and you don't know. You don't know if it's real. Some people probably looking at their hand right now wondering whether or not what they have on their hand is worth anything, but diamonds are not rare. A flawless diamond is rare, but sapphires and emeralds are way rarer, if that's even a word, because you just don't find them flawless very often, and you don't find them treated or enhanced in some way artificially. Most of the insurance scams that I observed were hearing secondhand what the person reported was stolen from their store. Every job that we did that Bill was able to go and talk to that person afterwards, without knowing that Bill was the one that helped rob him, we heard what he said was stolen. And it was always double, at least double. These guys are taking this problem and turning it into an opportunity. And that's why you're paying so much for insurance, is because these guys, insurance companies are getting screwed pretty bad. If you're really, really good at it, you will have knowledge of how many police are in that city, which is why we never pulled a job in Nashua, New Hampshire. Nashua, New Hampshire had one of the best police forces at the time. I grew up in Boston with organized crime. I wasn't in it, but we all knew the Angelos ran the state. We ran all of the waste management, all the construction. An entire section of Boston was devoted to strip clubs, drug dealing, and the second you stepped out of the combat zone and did any of that stuff, either an Angulo or somebody from that crew or a cop would thump you for it. That was the place you did it. And it ran really well. Bulger comes in and it just became completely disorganized. No way we would have robbed 22 stores while the Angulos were in power. They would have either come to us and asked for a piece of it, or they would have said, these stores are protected and you can't hit them. When you think to yourself, how does a father get his sons involved in something like this? My dad lived a very different childhood than we did. He grew up in Chelsea, right next to Heller's Bar. Heller's Bar was a mob bar. Right behind Heller's was a huge dirt parking lot where frequently my dad would leave his house and see a tractor trailer pulled from East Boston docks, where the mob picked up most of their stuff. They would park it in the back of Heller's, and that's where they would sell everything. And my dad saw this. So my dad followed every rule. He went to college. He was an upstanding member of society unless there was something on the ground that wasn't tied down that he could take. And that was the mentality, I think, of most people in Massachusetts at the time. Pay your taxes, keep the man off your back, but if you see an opportunity to take a little something, grab it. My father initially gave this guy his life savings to invest in importing diamonds into the country. This guy decided to take that money from my dad and then tell him that he never got the delivery. And my dad was in a bad place. He was in a very bad place. He finally asked if we would help him. He finally just sat down and said, here's the deal. You guys are gonna have to come out of college, you're gonna have to work full time. I don't have any money to pay for any of that stuff. Or we could go get the money back from this guy and set him up. And that's exactly what we did. And it started the beginning of 22 other robberies. It started as, we gotta save dad. And then my dad started presenting all the robberies to us as, we're helping people. We're going after this guy. He's dirty, and this guy ripped people off, and if we stop him, he won't rip anybody. It was like a Robin Hood kind of thing. After 5, you start saying, hey, we're not superheroes, and we're not here to save the world. What are we doing? And that's when things started to get very, my brother and I were very worried at how much further this was going to go. The real victims are anybody that we stole their dignity, their right to freedom, their right to move about the world without somebody tying them to a chair, and their families. It doesn't stop with them. It stops with anybody that loved that person and had to hear about what happened to them. I was arrested on December 26th of 1996. There was enough distinctiveness about us to separate us from anybody else doing it. There weren't a whole lot of crews. There weren't a lot of multiple people doing jobs. I went to rehab and I stopped doing robberies. My brother and father continued. They did 2 more and then they did 1 after prison. But I stopped because I had sobered up and I went back to school to become a drug and alcohol counselor. My brother was always arrested. My father was already arrested. They were both sitting, awaiting trial, and I knew they were coming for me. To me, prison was a lot like criminal university. So many inmates would go in there and be like, okay, what did you do? How did you get caught? Okay, and they leave with knowledge of how to get away with it. So prison it can be an education in terms of, if you want to keep doing what you're doing, that's the place to go and talk to the people that got caught and figure out how to do it right. I think the hardest part of my prison sentence wasn't the jail time. It's the stigma. I couldn't get hired. Regret sucks, man. It really does. It's not easy to live with. It was ultimately my decision. And I could say that I was 13 years old and wasn't capable of making those decisions, but I was 20. My father and brother passed away February 11th last year. My brother and I had a very difficult and complicated relationship. We very rarely got along. And when we bonded, it was in situations like this. So through our drug abuse, we bonded, through the robberies, we bonded, in prison, we bonded, but whenever we were outside and needed something substantial to solidify that bond, it was never there. The book I wrote is called Family Jewels, and it was my attempt to use the book as a tool to talk to kids, to talk to people, to maybe use how crazy this story is to kind of scare you straight. I work as a personal trainer now. I created my own certification. I wrote my own book that lists the programming for this type of exercise, and it is now approved by 4 certifying bodies for personal training. I do the podcast. I do Family Jewels podcast. Podcast allowed me to go into greater detail. It allowed me to break down each robbery individually.
I'm Jim Browning. I'm known as a scam baiter, and I hack into scammers' CCTV, and I've managed to close down hundreds of scam call centers. This is how crime works. What I do is disrupt multi-million-dollar scams, the ringleaders exposed, and those people have an awful lot of money behind them. Why the silhouette? Well, it can be quite dangerous. You can imagine the type of things that they may decide to do to stop me. up until recently, had a normal day job. And sometimes I would work at home and I would constantly get the same phone calls that I think most people get. And you instantly know it's a scam. But I was getting those so often that it was interrupting my normal work. I thought, I'm an engineer. I know about computers, know about networks. Maybe I can do something about this, or at least I want to find out what it is they're really after and maybe report the people in the hope that I could stop the calls. I encountered Fairmart Travels back in 2019. They were operating a pop-up scam. I was browsing the internet. Suddenly this message pops up saying I've got a virus, and I had to call a number that locked my keyboard and mouse. And from experience, I know that that's a scam, but I deliberately called the number. They told me that they were a Microsoft affiliate and they needed access to my computer. But I have this little trick where if someone connects to my computer, I can reverse that connection, and that enables me to see their computer. And I was able to find out quite a lot of data and video and audio. Of course, the people on the end of the phone are primed to persuade you that you've got a computer problem. They will want you to, although they may not say the words, remote access to your computer, they will deliberately misdiagnose it. And to fix that problem, even though there's no problem, you would have to pay them. And it varies anywhere between maybe a few £100 up to a few £1,000. They will talk reasonably technical sounding language deliberately, but it's all just a script. Most people who are victims of that scam think that it's some friendly person trying to help them out when in fact there was nothing wrong whatsoever. It's not just done once, they're scammed multiple times after that. The setup can be very tiny. You can run a scam call center out of a hotel room. You don't need particularly expensive computers to run a scam, and I think a lot of scammers know that. And what I typically find is they will run the oldest of old computers just because they're cheap. The average scam call center has between 10 and 20 people. Fairmart Travels, they set themselves up as a travel agency. They were running out of 2 buildings in a suburb of New Delhi. In those days, the front offices were all running legitimate work, but in literally the offices behind that building, they ran a scam operation. In fact, they used the same telephone system that they did for their legitimate work, but in the background, they would run this scam call center. So they had almost a perfect setup so that if the police ever did raid the places, they could always point the police to their legitimate work. They actually recorded their phone calls, and I was able to download over 70,000 scam phone calls from other operators in that room. It did help that I could see at the supervisor's computer, so I could see the messages going from the people who actually operated the calls right back to the CEO of the company. So if you can think about it, any normal office organization, they had exactly that structure. The agents are incentivized on how much money they make, and because of that, they get a bonus at the end of the month. So they had supervisors who would tot up every agent's performance. And if you can make more than 30 successful calls, for example, you will make more money. I have seen in other operations that if you don't make your targets, typically you're out of the business completely. It was an operation that ran 24/7. They would have different shifts. So they would target Australia early in their daytime. It would move to Europe in the afternoons and evenings, and then at nighttime it would be the USA. There was another person who was the accountant for the company. They knew which channel it came from, so what sort of scam operation they were running that day, which country it involved, which currency it involved, which payment gateway it involved. He would have all of the detail of that money going into huge spreadsheets, and of course then that would be laundered elsewhere. So they had everything you would expect in a real office building. They had a HR department. Of quality assurance department. They would actually listen to some of the scam phone calls and feed back to the agents how they could run the scam better. I was able to see exactly what the CEO was doing because there was a CCTV camera in his office. It was the only one with audio. And he would spend a small portion of the day looking after his legitimate business, the travel agency business. But an awful long part of the day was spent making sure that the next type of scam was going to happen. I did hear him discussing an Amazon scam and how he would set that up. Things like how they would process the money were discussed. Occasionally, I will encounter networks of money launderers, and if they're asking victims to transfer money, normally it will be to a bank account in their own country. And the reason for that is it's much, much more simple for money to go out of a victim account into a local bank account, a reasonably local bank account. But of course, it hasn't got back to the scammer yet, so there has to be a network of people who will take that initial transfer and move it between a number of countries. An average scam will have at least one money mule in the UK, one money mule at least in a different country other than India, typically Thailand, and between them they will move money between jurisdictions. I have seen Telegram and Skype groups specifically set up to allow money transfers to happen. So I know with Fairmark Technologies, I was able to see exactly where the money went when it came between the victims and right through to the company. So I could see as each payment was being made, there was an individual transaction in PayPal which went to a company called Adrit Technologies. And Amit Chon is the CEO of, or was the CEO of Adrit Technologies, so I got a direct payment link between the victims and his company. And I could tell that he was making at least tens of thousands of dollars per month, but it was closer to $100,000 a month. What they would get is average about $10,000 to $12,000 just from scams each day. But I've seen call centers which are upwards of 200 employees, and they can make more than $8 million a month. Now, I have encountered a victim in the UK who had already lost £100,000 to scammers. People write to me as well to say that they have lost a lot more than that again. And again, there's practically nothing I can do once the money has already been stolen. Seeking out victims, criminals absolutely use social media. I'm on a Facebook group where scammers sell people's personal data, and there's very little enforcement for that. They will also sell things like credit card numbers. Those are sold openly on Facebook. I get to hear a lot of the calls that scammers make, and I've heard everything from teenagers right through to people in their 90s falling for these. The types of scam, though, that I look at are more likely to affect older people. Fairmark Travels were a little bit different from the average scam call center that I look at because they pay a third party to put adverts onto websites. And the advert itself is called a malvert, a malicious advert. It goes full screen, has a bit of very loud audio saying your computer is a virus, but most importantly, it has a phone number on it. The one way to tell whether it's a scam is a phone number. If you see a phone number on your screen, 100% of the time that is going to be a scam. Your antivirus will not ask you to call a phone number. They wait for victims to come to them, then they would simply get the inbound calls. So that's how they seek out victims. The kind of victim they're after is somebody who's not computer literate. I have to lull them into a false sense of security. So I have to appear convincing. I can't be somebody who is very good with computers, type stuff in really quickly because they'll instantly get suspicious. So whenever I engage with scammers, I have a voice changer. I know in advance what my name, address, credit card, and everything else will be. I also have a fake bank page, which I will deliberately flash or show to a scammer to make it look as if I have loads of money. All I need is a little bit of knowledge about the system they use to make that phone call for me to hear other phone calls. I not only can hear the calls, I can see the phone numbers they are calling, and I can see a phone call has lasted more than, say, 5 minutes. It's very likely that that person is being scammed. And what I do is typically call the person when they've hung up and say, by the way, did you know that you were not speaking with your bank, or you were not speaking with Amazon? And that is quite often a surprise to the people who've been on the phone for so long, because they can be incredibly persuasive. They use terminology all the time. There's never a victim. There's always a customer. So you're a customer, of course, and that's the term I kind of hate, because not one person that I encounter is a real customer in any shape or form. Yes, process, and whenever you go for an interview in a scam call center, you have to use the term an Amazon process or a banking process or a refund process, but that is just shorthand for the refund scam or the bank scam or whatever. Whenever they build a rapport with their victims, everyone will sound just like their grandmother or their grandfather, because that way they sound more endearing. Obviously, when I can see one computer, just like the phone system, I can potentially also see the CCTV system that he used. A good example is Fairmart. I can see the guy actually run up his CCTV cameras, and he logged in with the username of admin and an 8-character password. It enabled me then to log in and just use the computer or the CCTV. The scam room itself actually had 4 cameras pointing all 4 directions, each corner of the room. It was difficult to know exactly who you're speaking to. Obviously, they give fake names, but knowing that they will want to connect to my computer, the very easy thing to do is to change my desktop background to a very garish color, like purple or green or something. And then as the scammer connects to it, look on the CCTV and see who has got the green or purple screen. And then I can pinpoint and go, right, I'm speaking to that particular guy in the corner there. That's the one I'm going to focus on. So I'll be kind of picking up bits and pieces of files which may be on their computers, again, just to help identify who they are. Sometimes some of the computers have ID card information or spreadsheets with real names on it. So I'll be kind of looking for that. I know this is a little bit vague, but equally I don't want to let the scammers know exactly all of my tricks, but there are definitely techniques that I can use to figure out exactly what they're doing. I was in the fortunate position that not only could I see live CCTV, but they actually had recordings of historic events. And when I did rewind the footage, I could see them position certain cameras and actually turn them around. I was able to kind of roughly work out where things were, but I still couldn't figure it out. So I have a colleague who does something very similar to me. He's called Carl Rock, and he's in India. He has got a drone. And I asked him, would you be able to help me take photographs to kind of figure out where these scam offices are? He flew the drone over the top of the main building and then out to the back of the building as well. When it comes to reporting crime, it's actually very difficult in India. The best way to get any action on the ground from India is to go directly to the local police where that call center is nearest. It is not enough to say the people in that building are pretending to be a bank or Amazon. What I have to do is present a victim to the local police to say this person has had money stolen and it comes from that building. And here are the people involved. And that makes it very, very difficult. Obviously, I try to approach the police to say, this scam is operating on your doorstep, but quite often that's ignored. And it's kind of a tolerated scam. If you seem to be stealing money from rich Westerners, for an example, that may be less of a crime in those countries than maybe other types of crime. Now, in the case of Fairmart, I was working with a documentary team. The BBC were involved. The police became interested only because of that involvement. Then the police raided those buildings. So they arrested Amit Chohan. They dismissed the case because there wasn't enough evidence. I would love to see tougher laws when it comes to call centres. I think there should be laws to say, if you're running a call centre, you have to give the person you're speaking the details of who you are, where you are, your real name, and your real company name. It would be easier, I think, to prosecute some of the scam call centres, and maybe that's the way to reduce some of them at least. I actually ask scammers, why do you do this? The answers that I usually get, there will be people who say the only way that I can make money is through scamming. And undoubtedly that's the case. But everybody's different. There are not enough jobs for young people. And don't forget, these people in general, they speak English, so they're well educated. They come from the equivalent of middle class backgrounds. They have their education levels. I've seen the CVs sitting on some of the computers. They generally know what they're getting into. So if there was an opportunity to have another job, some will tell me that they will take those other jobs. And some of them do say, I have no choice. I'm only going to do this for a year or two. I personally think the primary reason is the reason why so many people are in it is greed. I have had scammers who've said, well, I do this as kind of revenge for colonial corruption. I do speak to some scammers who do have a conscience, and some of them have already reached out to me and exposed their own bosses in the whole thing. And that's admirable. India is more than likely where your robocall is going to come from, which is a really sad reflection on India, because India is a fantastic country. But it now means that people, when they hear an Indian accent on the phone, are just that more wary, and that is incredibly sad. Other than India, I have personally encountered ones in Ukraine and Tunisia. The Tunisian call centre targeted French-speaking countries, including France. There's a few different ways that scammers will attempt to find victims, and I guess the primary one, someone pretending to be your bank or a large company like Amazon. Unfortunately, if you've got a landline, that is a typical thing you will hear every single day. And one of the biggest ones, for example, is a fake invoice. If you've started a conversation with a scammer, they want to get at your money. And they will target you in a few different ways. The first one is wanting access to your computer and therefore wanting access to your bank account. They will get you to make a transfer, or they'll blacken your screen and they'll make the transfer. The other one is they don't really need or want access to your computer, but they will try to convince you to go to your bank and move money by socially engineering you to send money or withdraw money, put it in a box, and people unbelievably still do this, and send it to another address. And the third one is they will persuade you to go out and buy a gift card, and there's different ways that they can do that, and read out the gift card number. And if you do that, that's equivalent to directly putting it into a scammer's account. And the most obvious way these days of getting money cleanly for scammers is to use cryptocurrency. There's other sorts of scams. You may have seen SMS messages saying there's a parcel being delivered, or a different sort of SMS message targeting someone in your family. Recently, I've come across a group who were operating out of London, and they were pretending to be the son or daughter of someone who had lost their phone. So they would send a message saying, "Hi mum, I've lost my phone. This is my new number. Can you contact me on this? I need to get some money quickly." It's not easy having multiple identities, and I have my own family life to deal with like everybody else. Doing this in the evening times did take up an awful lot of time, so I do work very odd hours, and I have to keep the same hours as scammers do. So, I'm on the night shift just with the scammers as well, so it can be difficult. I have worked in IT for quite a number of years, although these days I could maybe teach a course on it. I haven't got the formal qualifications. Because I have dug into scams more than the average person, I probably know scams better than most scammers. I'm still learning. I still want to understand better some of the systems that scammers use. They evolve, but I would like to think I evolve with them. I am working on projects that will help victims using AI before scammers start using AI against victims. So I have a YouTube page. The channel name is Jim Browning, which is dedicated to combating scammers.
My name's Rob Holmes. I'm a private investigator. I've stopped millions of dollars of counterfeit watches entering the U.S. market. This is how crime works. It's estimated that 23.3 million counterfeit watches are circulating in the U.S. right now. There have been plenty of stories of the counterfeit watch industry being tied to child labor, sweatshops, and even human trafficking. You're going to have organized criminals who are doing this kind of stuff. When I work undercover as a distributor, I have to be very credible. Doing what I do doesn't come without a little bit of fear. Many of the fakes nowadays come with the box and the authentication certificates. You used to see watches that would just have maybe one of the trademarks, like just the crown on the face, but not the crown on the dial. Now manufacturing has gotten so good that even the cheaper knockoffs have everything. There are people who buy $1,000 counterfeit watches, Patek, Rolex, Louis Vuitton, all the big brand names. And they buy these watches for $1,000 because they are near clones. And in that world, the current term is epic. You can't tell it from the original. And especially with some of the brands, especially Rolex, the only way you can tell is by opening up the watch and looking at the movement. Because the Rolex movement, there's no mistaking a Rolex movement from a counterfeit. I don't care how good the Chinese factories are. A Swiss movement made by Rolex is always going to be known once you open the back. If it is sold in America, there's a factory in China that makes an exact copy of it. It's just a matter of how high the quality is. Manufacturing in the counterfeiting world replicates the manufacturing in the real world. Wherever manufacturing is cheap, that's where manufacturing is going to happen. These factories can afford the same machines that the real companies use, and they use the same software. Often that software is stolen through industrial espionage. On these Chinese marketplaces, they have a tier for a manufacturer or a seller, a tier level where you can obtain an inspection by the marketplace. They'll have a third-party inspector come in and take photos and check your location for child labor, all the regular things that people would look for, and you can pay for a clean bill of health. But there's no telling what these factories are really doing. We know that some Chinese factories use forced labor. It used to be the 80s, 90s, even into the early 2000s. The watches would come here by container, and then the logos would be put on in factories here in the United States, in sweatshops right in the major cities here in the US. That's kind of stopped because the Chinese factories have become so good that the American factories couldn't keep up with the quality. We find that most of the product comes out of major ports, and Guangzhou, inside Guangdong. China became so good at logistics, it was much easier for people to sell as affiliates here in the United States and have them shipped from the Chinese factories or the middlemen. This is how good these Chinese factories are. QC, which means quality control. They'll send you a high-res photo of your item and the shipping label. So you can check the item, make sure it's the right model, and also make sure that the address is correct on your shipping label. You say yes, go ahead, boom. Within a day or so, you'll get the tracking number. Watches would be shipped in, say, one case of watches, say 1,000 watches or 10,000 watches in a small portion. And the rest of the container would end up being beach balls, cosmetics or anything, cheap stuff. What they do is they ship it to their clearinghouse, a distributor in Pennsylvania. They slap a new label on it and ship it to you from there. So it looks more domestic. And when it looks more domestic, it looks more trusted. But most counterfeit watches reach the United States through the U.S. Postal Service, or DHL. Shipped individually to the seller. You could buy one watch, you could buy 5 watches, you could buy 100 watches. I buy samples from all over the world. One time I had a package sent to me, and it was a toy alarm clock. I opened it up, and there was a watch inside. I haven't received a disguised counterfeit in several years, and I think it's because of how easy it is to get across the border with just a little bubble wrap. The watches you buy on the streets, they're usually bought the same way by the seller. If you buy 100 of them, they're $8 a piece. So you get 100 of those, package is only this big. Shipping's gonna cost $80, $90. And they know the Postal Service is flooded right now, and Customs is flooded right now. So it's really kind of a field day for the mailing of counterfeit watches. The U.S. Customs can't inspect every single package. They used to say they inspected one every 1,000, but I don't even know if that's possible anymore with everybody buying $20 dresses and things like that. Counterfeit distributors don't worry about the obstacles because the profit is so high. So if something gets stopped off at Customs, they'll just ship you a new one. And that happens very often, even with a container. Those 10,000 watches, they get caught up in Customs, that'll just be the cost of business. So those obstacles are pretty simple for them to bypass. In my perception, the demand for fakes, non-deceptive counterfeits, where you know it's fake, is simply because people like getting something over on the man. From the 80s until now, I found that demand has been pretty consistent throughout the years. I mean, no matter what the economy is looking like, people like a bargain and people like to spend less for something that looks nice. Let me explain the gray market a little. There is a market where people think they're getting a deal. You'll see, 20% off retail, things like that. There's a gray market where things fall off the truck and things are diverted outside of the original supply chain. And once they get here in the United States, they can sell legitimate products, and this is including the watch industry. They can sell legitimate products at 10, 20% off the original price, and they're real. But these companies have databases with those serial numbers in them. And you take it to a real repair shop, they stick it through the database because a lot of watches are stolen. So you take it to a real repair shop, oh, sorry, this watch was a gray market product intended for another place. So that's why once you buy something on the gray market, you're kind of always working underground. So that leaves you susceptible to buying the epic fakes, the ones that are $1,000, but you're paying $6 or $7 because you think it's wink, wink, falls off the truck. And a lot of these companies too that deal in the gray market do what's called mixing. And what they'll do is they'll have some genuine gray market and some that are counterfeit, and they'll just mix them all in. Or you look like a sucker, I'll sell you the fake and I'll sell this guy the genuine. It's a very interesting world, the secondhand market, because it is kind of self-regulated. Obviously, they self-regulate because of lawsuits too. If I make a test buy from one of these sites and it turns out to be counterfeit, they can get sued. So yeah, so there's a lot of liability at stake there too. So the legitimate ones don't do that, but again, you'll have the shady ones, especially the ones that you walk up in tourist areas. And they sell genuine secondhand watches, but maybe the one you have, is a fake. I tell people whether you're gonna buy a product or you're gonna have a product repaired, go to an authorized dealer. But yeah, these repair markets are very shady. There was a case in the 90s that my father and stepmother worked called the Fort Worth Gold and Jewelry Exchange. And this guy, his name was Ronnie Cooper. He advertised in all the national magazines. And he would have ads that said, we buy gold, we buy watches, we sell Rolex watches. And he would even do repairs. What he would do when he bought the watches was he would replace the gold with gold plated. And he would constantly be doing that. So you'd be buying a genuine watch, but most of the gold was swapped out. And he did this for many years. And jewelers still do that. They're often called Franken watches in the replica world. He got 5 years, the guy. He got 5 years for mail fraud. That's what they got him on, because all this stuff went through, shipping and the postal service and things like that. The brands don't like the secondary market because they take away from you buying a brand new product. My dad was the guy on Canal Street in the 1980s and 1990s who caught the folks that were selling counterfeit watches. I grew up in the 80s going on raids with my father and making undercover buys. Canal Street was the epicenter for counterfeit watches in the entire United States. They had Midtown. That was where all the folks with the briefcases would show up, okay? Those guys would walk around and, the old, hey, buddy, want to buy a watch? That kind of thing. Or they would set up a briefcase with legs, and they'd be very mobile. In Chinatown, they would be standalone stores with big metal roll-down, roll-up doors. On raid days, they would go with a van or a U-Haul truck with off-duty cops and firemen inside the back of the trucks. And they would have spotters along the way who would go to local diners and tell them the addresses where they've spotted those watches that day. Then the people would fly out of the trucks, and if they didn't get there in time and the guys rolled down and locked the doors, we had industrial strength saws where we could saw through those locks. It wouldn't be uncommon for my father to come home with a U-Haul truck full of bags, hefty bags, full of counterfeit watches. Actually, I was the only 14-year-old at my high school that was walking around with a Rolex watch. Everybody knew it was fake, but, during my dad's Canal Street years, he would hire out-of-work actors in New York to disguise themselves and go conduct undercover investigations. Those people dressed up as homeless people, pregnant people, everything you could think of, so that they're going through one day at a time and they don't look like the same person. Doing enforcement on Canal Street, it was no hayride. He had bodyguards, and he also had constant threats. There were people with guns shooting at them. There were very often times where people would come right after my father. I've been investigating counterfeit watches professionally since 1995. So when I started my company, all the luxury brands knew who I was, and they knew I started my own firm. And then I started getting cases from the luxury brands. During my undercover buy process, we have undercover identities set up all over the United States. So, I could buy from the same website 5 times and they would think it's 5 different people. I have every counterintelligence method you can imagine. We do everything we can to make sure that these identities are not traced back to us. The brands usually work directly with law enforcement, if they can, because it's expensive to hire an investigator. My cases are typically cases that might go civil or a case that law enforcement doesn't have the time for. And then once my case is finished, completed, it's put on what I call a silver platter. And then they will pass it on to law enforcement. There's various terminology in the counterfeit world. In the watch industry, a replica is a near-perfect, or at least look-alike version with the trademarks of an actual product. But then you have lower-level counterfeits. You have, say, $300 to $500 counterfeits, and they're mid-level. And then you have anything under $300. They call them The funny thing is, those cheap watches, they're the ones you buy on the street. The keywords to find these counterfeits evolve because of enforcement mechanisms. You can't just Google counterfeit Rolex or counterfeit Louis Vuitton or even replica. The word replica for the last 10, 12 years has been pretty much blacklisted everywhere along with brand names. So they would come up with different words. They would also use letter swaps. Like for Rolex, they could use ROIEXX. If you're seeing words like replica, clone, dupe, or 1:1, 1-to-1, you're probably looking at a counterfeit. If you're trying to figure out if a watch is a counterfeit, first you need a magnifying glass, and then you want to look at the details on the watch face. If there's any imperfection whatsoever, it's not real. One of the great myths of counterfeit watches is that the genuine has a sweeping hand and the counterfeit has a ticking hand. Well, that was resolved sometime in the mid-90s. So most counterfeits now have a sweeping hand, so don't be fooled into thinking that's a way to tell a counterfeit from a real. So I was just handed a watch for filming purposes, and I can tell this one's genuine because, see, there's a crown logo at the 12 o'clock mark, and the crown logo has an oval at the headpiece part of the crown, and that's etched in perfectly. The quality of the craftsmanship of this watch is impeccable. The brand name is printed there perfectly. Also, with many of these watches, there's a magnifier at the date. It's called the Cyclops. And counterfeiters don't always get that right. And also, the date with the magnifier can just be a little off. It's not perfectly. If the number's 12, the day is 12, it's going to be exactly there. It's not going to be partially there. And a lot of the counterfeits, they just can't get the date exactly right. And the Cyclops, too, the original brands have a very specific non-reflective material they put on that Cyclops that holds it onto the watch. And that's very hard to duplicate as well. So the clarity of the Cyclops is very, very important. Also, you'll see the brand name on the inside of the band. Now, the high-end counterfeits may have those, but you do have to look for these things. Also, the registered trademark on the back, you can look for that and see if they've gone to that great detail. And with this particular watch, because it was made, I'd say probably at least 20 years ago, maybe longer, in order to find the serial number, you would have to actually take off the band here. And you would have underneath the band edge here and here, you'll have a serial number and you'll have a model number. Especially with the Submariner and the diving watches, the bezel is very difficult to make. So the Swiss engineering of the bezel is going to be perfect with a genuine watch. Many of the counterfeits, it's kind of jingly as you're moving it. A lot of this stuff isn't one specific thing. You look at the quality and you say, wait, this isn't real because, this is a little shaky. It should be more solid. It's a little light, should be heavier. The counterfeit watch industry is a financial crime. You deal with all kinds of fraud in this world, especially here in the United States, bank fraud, all this kind of stuff. In the 1940s, there was a law passed called the Lanham Act, and it made counterfeiting trademark goods illegal. And that law stood for a very long time. There were no penalties, though. It was sort of symbolic. And then my father, along with a very small community back then of folks lobbying the U.S. government to strengthen the laws, the Anti-Counterfeiting Act of 1984 was passed. And the Anti-Counterfeit Act of 1984 created penalties for each one of these offenses. Currently, the federal laws are in trafficking. So trafficking is illegal federally. So that's where customs comes in. But most of the sale or display of counterfeit goods is state law. So in New York, New Jersey, California, almost every state has a display for counterfeit as a penalty, and also in their penal codes, the sale of counterfeits. I've seen people face some serious jail time for selling counterfeits. Often they're the most egregious, but on the street level folks, it's the repeaters, just like with drugs. Someone purchasing counterfeit goods online probably isn't going to enter law enforcement's radar or the brand's radar unless they are named or discovered as a supplier to someone else. Often, because purchasing isn't necessarily, it's not illegal to purchase, but obviously trafficking is, and you're bringing things over across the border. I've seen the civil penalties get very steep. When my clients want to sue someone, often we'll look for assets. If a person owns a house and the mortgage is paid off, you know, these people have the ability to pay $70,000, $100,000 in restitution, and a judge will, you know, often comply. So I've seen people's lives get ruined by selling counterfeits. It was in the late 80s when my father came across BTK, the Born to Kill gang, Vietnamese mafia. One day, his brother, who worked with him, saw a wanted poster with a $200,000 price on my father's head. Turns out, the Born to Kill gang, they were charging all of these vendors for protection, but they couldn't protect them against my father. So they figured if they killed my father, they would at least alleviate the problem and they would justify their own extortion racket. And because of that, we had locks on every door, every window. And my father told me one day, I remember, he said, "Rob, I know you don't like listening to me, but if I ever say duck or jump, you better do it because it might mean your life." And I always took that seriously after that. I still do. When my father's Canal Street work started really taking off, I was uninterested in the family business. I was 17, 18, 19 years old, and I was kind of going off doing my own thing. But my brother was like 13, 14 years old, and he was primed to do this work. He was bred for it. So my brother was running out, gathering license plates and, you know, looking in windows, in factory windows and things like that. I actually rebelled against the family business, and I went to Bible college. And I decided to drive to LA to become a stand-up comic. Turns out I wasn't very funny, but in the meantime, I needed a day job. But then I started going on Rage, just like my father, on the opposite coast. And it was amazing. Los Angeles' area, similar to Canal Street in New York, is called Santee Alley. And it was a several block area, just like New York's Chinatown. It is filled with counterfeits. In the 90s, Santee Alley, just like Canal Street, it was the Wild West. Everywhere you went, there were watches everywhere. I mean, people had them up and down their arms. They had them in briefcases. They had them in at booths. They had people who rented space out in front of booths and paid thousands of dollars for that. Yeah, and then after years and years of doing that, in the 90s, my boss retired in 2001, and I started my own company. So I started my company in 2001. I was working a lot of the similar cases with my father and my brother. So then my father passed in 2004. Yeah, after my father died, I thought it was important to continue the family legacy. His company folded because he had nobody in New York to follow in his footsteps. And then after he passed, my business was taking off. And I needed to duplicate myself. And I figured, what better way to duplicate myself than to partner with my brother? Ever since then, I mean, there's not a day that goes by that we don't think about Dad. I mean, it's hard for me not to look at my brother and see something, you know, one of my dad's traits. We grew up watching him work. He was our hero, and we emulate him. We both do. So yeah, I mean, it's nice. I mean, sometimes I feel like he's in the room.